The rain at 8:17 p.m. did not fall. It drilled. Each drop was a cold, silver needle hitting the asphalt of the alley, raising a mist of gasoline and decay. The sound was a constant hiss, a counterpoint to the city's electric hum. Maya felt it less as water and more as a pressure, a weight on the thin wool blanket she had pulled over her head. The blanket, her only inheritance from a world that had forgotten her, smelled of damp earth and her own fading warmth. Beneath it, she was a knot of quiet endurance, 19 years old and folded into the architecture of neglect. The world beyond the alley's mouth was a blur of smeared headlights and hurried footsteps, a place she observed but no longer belonged to. Then, a different sound shattered the rhythm of the night. It was the sharp, percussive crack of glass striking brick, followed by the wet, ugly thud of a fist meeting flesh. Maya flinched, pulling the blanket tighter. Trouble was a predator, and her only defense was to be invisible, to be nothing more than a pile of discarded rags. But the sounds continued, punctuated by a voice, slick with unearned authority and cheap liquor. "Look at you, old man. Your leather's older than you are. You think that vest makes you tough." Laughter followed, thin and cruel, from 2 or 3 others. Peeking through a tear in the blanket, Maya saw them. 3 young men, dressed in expensive, water-resistant jackets that shed the rain like it was an insult, cornered a single, large figure. The man was broad-shouldered, his back to her, a thick leather vest covering a denim jacket. He was older, his gray-streaked beard visible even in the dim light. He stood his ground, his fists raised, but he was outnumbered and off balance. One of the young men, the leader, shoved him again. "My father runs this city. You are nothing." The words hung in the air, a declaration of privilege. At that moment, a police cruiser glided past the mouth of the alley. Its blue and red lights were off, but its presence was a promise of order. The driver, a silhouette behind the rain-streaked glass, slowed, head turning toward the commotion. Maya held her breath. The officer's gaze swept over the scene, the entitled aggressors, the cornered man, and then it moved on. The cruiser did not stop. It accelerated smoothly back into the flow of traffic, a vessel of indifference sailing away from a small, drowning world. The sight broke something in Maya. It wasn't a decision born of courage, but of a deeper, more primal instinct. It was the simple, unbearable sight of a system confirming its own corruption, of the strong preying on the weak while the guardians looked away. Her eyes darted around her small domain. A stack of empty metal bins, slick with rainwater, stood precariously against the wall. Without a second thought, she pushed. The sound was a magnificent, chaotic symphony of metal crashing against brick and concrete. It was a thunderclap in the confined space, an explosion of noise that was utterly alien to the alley's usual quiet misery. The 3 young men jumped, their attack broken, their heads snapping toward the source of the noise. In that half-second of distraction, the old man moved. He was not a brawler, he was a fighter. He drove his shoulder into one man's chest, sending him stumbling back into his friend. He blocked a wild punch from the leader and returned it with a short, brutal jab to the jaw. The leader staggered, his arrogance replaced by a look of shocked pain. They were bullies, not warriors. The fight was over before it began. They scrambled away, melting back into the city's shadows, leaving behind only the smell of their cologne and the lingering echo of their cruelty. The big man stood breathing heavily, one hand pressed to his ribs. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness until they found her. Maya was still frozen by the bins, the wet blanket slipping from her shoulders. He took a step closer, not with menace, but with a kind of weary curiosity. "Did you do that?" His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting underground. Maya could only nod, her throat tight with fear. He looked from her to the retreating figures, then back again. He saw the frayed edges of her clothes, the hollows in her cheeks. He saw not a savior, but a child living in a hole. He winced as he straightened up, pulling a worn leather wallet from his back pocket. He took out a $50 bill, the only one he had. He held it out to her. "For the noise," he said, his voice softer now. You might have saved me a broken bone or two. Maya stared at the money, then at his face. His eyes were kind. She shook her head. They were hurting you, she whispered, the words barely audible over the rain. The police. They didn't stop, he nodded, a grim understanding passing between them. He knew about the police who didn't stop. He tucked the money back into his wallet. What's your name, kid? Maya. I'm Bear, he said. He looked at her for a long moment, imprinting her face on his memory. You stay safe, Maya. He turned and walked out of the alley, his heavy boots leaving deep prints in the wet grime. A lone, resilient figure disappearing into a city that had failed them both. The fluorescent lights of the 12th Precinct station hummed with a sterile, monotonous buzz that scraped at the nerves. The air smelled of burnt coffee, damp wool, and institutional disinfectant. David Bear Kowalski sat on a hard plastic chair, the cold seeping through his damp denim. A dull ache throbbed in his ribs, a steady rhythm marking the time he was wasting. He had been waiting for 47 minutes. Finally, a sergeant with a face like a worn leather shoe and a name tag that read Miller called his name. Bear approached the high counter, a barrier designed to establish authority and maintain distance. I want to report an assault, Bear said, his voice flat. He gave the time, the location. He described the 3 young men, focusing on the leader. Said his father runs the city. Name's Harris. Liam Harris. Miller's pen stopped moving. He looked up, his eyes suddenly sharp with a kind of cynical intelligence. He knew the name. Councilman Richard Harris was a major figure, a man whose picture was often in the papers, shaking hands and cutting ribbons. Harris, Miller repeated, the name tasting like a problem. You sure about that? I'm sure, Bear said. He noticed the shift in the sergeant's posture, the subtle closing off. The invisible gears of the system were already turning, grinding against him. He and his friends jumped me. Unprovoked, Miller sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of manufactured weariness. Look, Mr. Kowalski, we get a lot of this. Drunks get into it in an alley, words are exchanged, maybe a few shoves. In the morning, everyone's forgotten about it. I'm not drunk, Bear said, his voice dangerously quiet. And I'm not forgetting. Did you require medical attention? Miller asked, his pen now doodling small squares on a notepad. No serious injury. Just a scuffle. Boys being boys, the phrase landed like a fistful of salt in a wound. It was the official language of dismissal, a verbal tool to shrink a crime into an inconvenience. They were 3-1, Bear pressed, leaning slightly on the counter. And there was a witness. Miller's interest flickered for a moment. A witness? Name and address. Her name is Maya. She lives in that alley. The light in Miller's eyes died instantly. He leaned back in his chair, a small, smug smile playing on his lips. Oh, a transient. You want to bring a homeless kid in here as your star witness against the son of Councilman Harris. He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Her testimony is worthless. Less than worthless. The defense would eat her alive. Hell, we'd probably have to arrest her for vagrancy. The wall was no longer invisible. It was solid, made of procedure and prejudice, and Sergeant Miller was its gatekeeper. He took down a perfunctory report, his handwriting deliberately sloppy, getting Bear's name slightly wrong. He promised to look into it. A promise they both knew was a lie. Bear watched him file the paper at the bottom of a teetering stack. It was a burial. He walked out of the precinct, the automatic doors hissing shut behind him, leaving him on the rain-slicked steps. The city felt different now. The indifference he had seen in the passing cruiser's driver was not an anomaly. It was the policy. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, protecting the powerful from the consequences of their actions and discarding the inconvenient truths of people like him, and especially people like Maya. He stood there for a long time, the cold rain soaking his jacket, but he barely felt it. He was thinking of the girl in the alley, the one who had made a noise when everyone else, even the law, had remained silent. Her testimony was worthless to them, but to him it was the only thing that mattered. Maya's world was circumscribed by a 4-block radius and defined by a handful of objects. Her home was a backpack. Its canvas faded to a pale, bruised purple, the zippers held together with a paperclip. Inside, her life was catalogued with a minimalist's precision. There was a half-used bar of soap wrapped in a plastic bag, a toothbrush with splayed bristles, and a small, dog-eared paperback of a book she'd read a dozen times. Its story a more reliable refuge than any physical shelter. The most important item was a photograph, its corners softened from years of handling. It showed a woman with Maya's eyes, smiling, a summer sun lighting her hair. It was the only proof she had that she had once belonged to someone. Her days were a study in quiet motion. She knew the rhythms of the city's underbelly, which bakeries threw out day-old bread at dawn, which library branches didn't ask for ID to use the restroom, which subway grates exhaled the warmest air on the coldest nights. She was an expert in the art of taking up as little space as possible, of angling her body in a doorway so as not to obstruct the path, of lowering her gaze to avoid confrontation. She had not always been this way. There were memories, fragmented and hazy, of a small apartment that smelled of paint and turpentine. Her mother had been an artist, a woman who saw color and light where others saw only gray concrete. She had taught Maya how to draw, how to see the shape of things. "Everything has a line," she used to say, her fingers guiding Maya's. "You just have to find it." But a sickness had found her mother's line and erased it. After that came the system, a series of sterile foster homes where she was a file number, a monthly stipend, a problem to be managed. She aged out at 18, handed a bus token and a list of shelters that were already full. The world had opened its jaws and she had simply fallen through the cracks. Her integrity was a quiet, stubborn thing, a muscle she exercised in small, unseen ways. One afternoon, huddled in the alcove of a closed theater, she found a man's wallet lying on the pavement. It was thick with cash, hundreds of dollars, more money than she had seen in years. Her stomach ached with a hunger that was a physical presence. The temptation was a roar in her ears. She opened it, looking for an ID. The driver's license showed a man with tired eyes and a young daughter perched on his shoulders. She saw the photo, and the roar subsided to a whisper. She walked 12 blocks to the address on the license and slipped the wallet into the mail slot, her heart pounding. She ran before anyone could see her, her hunger undiminished, but a different kind of emptiness had been filled. That night, her stomach empty, she held the photograph of her mother and remembered the smell of paint. This was the cost of her life, a constant negotiation between her needs and her character. The world saw a homeless girl, a statistic, a ghost. It did not see the girl who loved the smell of old books, who could draw a perfect circle freehand, who had returned a wallet full of cash because it was the right thing to do. It did not see the quiet dignity she carried in the hollows of her bones, a resilience forged in a crucible of loss and neglect. The city's indifference soon curdled into something more sinister. A few days after the incident in the alley, Maya was sitting on her usual patch of sidewalk when a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Liam Harris got out, flanked by the same two friends. He wasn't drunk this time. He was sober, and that made his smirk even more menacing. He walked over to where she sat, her small paper cup with a few coins in it on the ground before her. He looked down at her, his eyes cold and empty. "You," he said, the word an accusation. He didn't have to say more. She knew he recognized her. She was the one who had made the noise. He nudged her cup with the toe of his expensive shoe, sending the coins skittering across the wet pavement. "Clean up your trash," he said, before getting back in his car and speeding off. It was a small cruelty, but it was a message. "We see you. We know who you are." The harassment became a part of her daily routine. They didn't physically harm her, not yet. Their tactics were designed to erode her spirit, to make her feel hunted and worthless. They would accidentally spill coffee near her sleeping bag, leaving it soaked and useless. They would follow her from a distance, their presence a constant, oppressive weight on her shoulders. One evening, they cornered her near the library, not touching her, but forming a tight circle around her, their silent, leering faces a cage of intimidation. The fear was a living thing now, a cold knot in her stomach that never went away. The alley, once a grim sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Every shadow held a potential threat. Every passing car made her flinch. She tried to seek help. She walked to the 12th precinct, the same station where Bear had been dismissed. The officer at the front desk was a different one, but the attitude was the same. She tried to explain, her voice trembling, that she was being followed, harassed. By who? The officer asked, not looking up from his computer screen. Liam Harris. The officer stopped typing. He looked at her then, his gaze sweeping over her worn clothes, her unwashed hair. It was a look of profound disbelief. Councilman Harris's son is following you? He asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. And what exactly has he done? Has he touched you? Threatened you directly? No, but... Then there's no crime, the officer said, turning back to his screen. Don't waste our time with this nonsense. Now move along before I cite you for loitering. She was turned away, her fear dismissed as fantasy. The system that had failed to protect Bear now actively refused to protect her. Her helplessness was absolute. The community, the shopkeepers and pedestrians who saw her every day, became part of the problem. They saw the harassment. They saw Liam's car idling by the curb. They saw Maya's growing fear. But they did nothing. They would turn their heads, suddenly fascinated by a window display, or cross the street to avoid getting involved. Their silence was a form of consent, an unspoken agreement that the suffering of a girl like Maya was not their concern. Their apathy was the soil in which Liam's cruelty grew. Maya felt herself shrinking, becoming more invisible with each passing day. She was trapped in a nightmare where the monsters were real, the guardians were blind, and the witnesses had all looked away. Her small world was closing in, and she was running out of places to hide. Bear sat at the long, scarred wooden table in the Sons of Odin clubhouse. The air was thick with the smell of old leather, stale beer, and motor oil, the scent of his brotherhood. The clubhouse was a converted warehouse, its walls adorned with chapter flags, old photographs, and the immutable laws of their code. He hadn't been able to shake the image of Maya's face, or the sound of Sergeant Miller's dismissive laugh. He nursed a bottle of water, the ache in his ribs a constant reminder of the debt he owed. Preacher, the chapter president, sat at the head of the table. He was a man carved from granite and conviction, with a shaved head and a beard that reached his chest. He was called preacher not for his piety, but for the quiet, powerful sermons he delivered on loyalty, honor, and the meaning of their patch. He didn't speak often, but when he did, the room fell silent. Bear finally broke the quiet. They dismissed the report, he said, his voice a low growl. Assault on a member. They called it boys being boys. A murmur of anger went through the room. An insult to one was an insult to all. But Bear wasn't finished. That wasn't the part that was eating him alive. That's not it, he continued, looking directly at Preacher. The kid who helped me, the girl in the alley, Harris's whelp and his friends, they're going after her now. Because she was a witness. Because she helped me. Because she's got no one. He let the last words hang in the air. She's got no one. Preacher leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. His eyes, deep-set and fiercely intelligent, were locked on Bear. He understood the unspoken calculus of the street. He knew what happened to the vulnerable when they crossed the powerful. The system protected its own, and a homeless girl was not one of its own. She was an externality, a piece of inconvenient data to be deleted. The code of the Sons of Odin was not a set of criminal statutes. It was a moral compass. It was built on a simple, unshakable foundation. They protected their own. But the definition of their own was broader and deeper than blood or membership. It extended to the defenseless, the forgotten, the ones the world had thrown away. It was a code of honor forged in the fires of shared hardship and a deep distrust of a system that so often failed the common man. Preacher was silent for a full minute, the weight of his decision settling over the room. The other members, Doc, a former combat medic, Tiny, a man whose name was a running joke, and a dozen others, watched him, waiting. They knew what Bear's words meant. This was not about revenge for a bar fight. This was about a fundamental principle. Finally, Preacher spoke. His voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority that filled every corner of the warehouse. No one is no one. The phrase was simple, almost a tautology, but in that room it was a declaration of war. It was the trigger. It meant that Maya's isolation had ended. It meant that her status as a non-person had been revoked. It meant that the full weight of the Sons of Odin Brotherhood was now her shield. "She's got us now," Preacher said, his gaze sweeping across the table, meeting the eyes of every man there. "Doc, find out where the kid is. Make sure she's safe. Tiny, you're with him. No contact, just watch." He then turned back to Bear. "Get the word out. All chapters. We're going to have a meeting." A public 1 inch. The emotion in the room had transformed. The simmering anger had cooled, solidifying into a disciplined, collective resolve. This was not a call for chaotic violence. It was a call to order, their order. It was the activation of a code that the outside world misunderstood. A code that, in this moment, was the only true justice available to a girl named Maya. The mobilization began not with a roar, but with a series of quiet clicks and low-toned calls. At 9 p.m., Preacher sat in his small, Spartan office at the back of the clubhouse. He picked up a secure burner phone. His first call was to the president of the Valley chapter, a man known only as Rook. "Preacher, we're invoking the shield," he said, using the coded phrase for a high-priority, non-violent protective action. "Target is a civilian, a child." High-profile opposition. There was no need for lengthy explanation. The code was the context. "How many?" Rook's voice was gravelly, professional. "As many as you can spare. We need a presence. Not a threat. Presence. City Hall. Friday. 10 a.m. sharp. Consider it done," Rook said, and the line went dead. The next call went north to the mountain chapter, then east to the coast. Each conversation was brief, precise, stripped of all but the essential information. Headcounts were confirmed. Routes were planned. At 9:05 p.m., the numbers began to solidify. 12 bikes from the valley, 20 from the coast, 8 from the mountains. But they were the old guard, men whose silent presence carried the weight of 100 others. By midnight, the number was over 150, and still growing. In garages and workshops across the state, the preparation was methodical. Chrome was polished not for vanity, but for uniformity. Engines were checked, tires were gauged, fuel tanks were filled. This was not the chaotic gearing up for a turf war. It was the disciplined, almost reverent preparation for a ceremony. Each man cleaned his leather cut, the Sons of Odin patch a symbol of their collective identity. They were assembling not as a gang, but as an army of guardians. Meanwhile, Doc, the ex-medic, made a different kind of call. He dialed his sister, Sarah Jenkins, a reporter for an independent online news outlet known for its investigative work. "Sarah, it's me," he said. "I've got something for you. It's real." City Hall rot. Deep and ugly. Sarah was skeptical. She loved her brother, but she was wary of his world. "What is it, Mike? Another story about zoning laws for bike shops?" "No," Doc said, his voice serious. "It's about Councilman Harris and his son, and a girl they're trying to erase." He gave her the bare bones. The assault on Bear, the police cover-up, the harassment of the homeless girl who witnessed it. He gave her Maya's name. "There will be a gathering on Friday. City Hall. You should be there. Bring a camera." The mention of Harris, a politician with a carefully crafted family man image, piqued her professional interest. The story had the whiff of hypocrisy, a scent she was trained to follow. She hung up and immediately began to dig. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing public records, cross-referencing police blotters, searching for any mention of Liam Harris. She found 2 sealed juvenile records and a recently dismissed drunk driving charge. Pattern began to emerge. At the same time, Bear and Tiny found Maya. She was huddled in the doorway of a closed bookstore, trying to stay out of a biting wind. She flinched when they approached, her eyes wide with terror. Tiny, a mountain of a man, stayed back, Understanding his size could be intimidating. Bear knelt down, keeping a respectful distance. "Maya," he said softly. "It's Bear." From the other night, she recognized him. The fear in her eyes subsided slightly, replaced by confusion. "We know what's been happening," Bear said. "With Harris's son. We're going to put a stop to it. But we need you to be brave for one more day. We're going to stand with you. All of us. You won't be alone anymore." He didn't touch her. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He just offered her the one thing she hadn't had in years, the possibility of protection. She looked from his earnest face to the giant of a man standing guard at the corner, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. Felt like hope. Friday morning broke clear and cold, the sky a pale, unforgiving blue. At 10 a.m., Councilman Richard Harris stood on the steps of City Hall, bathed in the bright, artificial light of television cameras. He was at a podium, announcing a new public-private partnership to fund youth outreach programs. His voice was smooth, resonant, the well-practiced instrument of a career politician. He spoke of community, of safety, of protecting the city's most vulnerable. The irony was a suffocating blanket. The confrontation began not as a sight, but as a sound. It was a low, distant rumble, a vibration felt in the soles of the feet before it was registered by the ears. At first, it was mistaken for a passing freight train or a construction project. But it didn't fade. It grew, deepening into the unmistakable, syncopated thunder of V-twin engines. One by one, the heads of the assembled press corps and city officials turned, searching for the source. They appeared at the end of the long boulevard leading to City Hall. 2 bikes, then a dozen, rolling in perfect staggered formation. They were not speeding or swerving. Their pace was slow, deliberate, a funereal procession of chrome and black leather. They were followed by another wave, and another, until the entire street was filled with them. The sound was immense, a physical force that vibrated in the chest, drowning out the councilman's speech. They did not block traffic. They flowed into every available legal parking space along the plaza, their movements coordinated with an unnerving, silent precision. The engines were cut, one after another, the wave of sound receding into an even more profound silence. Over 200 riders dismounted. They were men of all ages and sizes, their faces set, their eyes forward. They wore their cuts, the Sons of Odin insignia, a stark, unified symbol. They did not speak. They did not gesture. They simply stood by their bikes, forming a silent, impassable crescent around the City Hall plaza. The police detail, a handful of officers assigned to the press conference, were frozen with uncertainty. No laws were being broken. It was not a protest. It was a vigil. They were simply present. Councilman Harris faltered at the podium, his smile frozen on his face. His security detail moved closer, their hands on their weapons, their eyes nervously scanning the sea of silent bikers. The media, smelling a far better story than a boilerplate press release, swung their cameras away from the politician and toward the unfolding spectacle. Then, a path opened in the center of the riders. Bear and Preacher walked through it. Between them, looking small and terrified but with a newfound straightness in her spine, was Maya. They had given her a clean jacket and a warm meal, but they had not hidden who she was. She was the heart of this confrontation, and her presence was non-negotiable. They walked her to the front of the crowd, placing her directly in the sight line of the cameras and, more importantly, of Councilman Harris. They stood on either side of her, 2 human shields, their stance protective, not aggressive. Harris stared at her, and for a fleeting second, his political mask slipped. His face, seen in the unforgiving zoom of a telephoto lens, was a canvas of rage and cornered fear. He knew exactly who she was. The entire plaza was now silent, a tableau of power confronted by truth. The bikers, the press, the city officials, and the handful of curious onlookers who had stopped to watch, they were all witnesses now. The public exposure had begun, not with a shout, but with the lawful, disciplined arrival of a brotherhood that had decided a forgotten girl was worth more than a powerful man's lies. The tense silence was broken by a single, clear voice. Councilman Harris Sarah Jenkins stepped forward from the throng of reporters, her microphone held steady, her expression professionally neutral. Her research had been fruitful. She had connected the dots, found the buried reports, and uncovered a pattern of behavior that was about to be laid bare. Sarah Jenkins, with the Sentinel. Can you comment on the assault allegations filed against your son, Liam Harris, on the night of October 12th? An incident involving Mr. David Kowalski, a decorated veteran. The question landed like a stone in a still pond. The other reporters began to murmur, their own phones suddenly out, furiously searching the names. Harris's press secretary, a young woman with a panicked look in her eyes, tried to step in. The councilman is here to discuss the youth initiative. We're not taking off-topic questions, but Sarah did not back down. She held her ground, her gaze locked on the councilman. Harris forced a dismissive smile, the kind he had used 1,000 times to deflect inconvenient inquiries. My son's life is a private family matter, he said, his voice a little too tight. I'm sure you can understand I won't be litigating teenage squabbles in the press. Is that what you call it when your son and his friends put a man in the hospital? Sarah pressed, her voice sharp. Because my sources indicate Mr. Kowalski suffered 3 fractured ribs. And the police report, which was filed and subsequently buried by a Sergeant Miller at the 12th Precinct, confirms this. Furthermore, we have testimony from multiple local business owners who have provided security footage of your son and his friends stalking and harassing a homeless minor for the past week. The witness to the original assault. A young woman named Maya. She gestured toward the girl standing between Bear and Preacher. Would you like to see the footage, Councilman? We have it queued up and ready to send to every news desk in the city. This was the moment of revelation. The mask did not just slip. It shattered. The polished veneer of the public servant evaporated, revealing the raw, ugly face of a corrupt father protecting his criminal son. Harris's face went pale, then flushed with a dark, blotchy red. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. In the crowd, near the back, Liam Harris, who had come to watch his father's triumph, turned to flee, but his escape route was blocked. A wall of silent, leather-clad men stood before him. They did not touch him. They did not speak to him. They simply occupied the space, their collective presence an immovable object. He was trapped, not by force, but by the sheer weight of their moral judgment. Sarah Jenkins held up a tablet, its screen glowing. On it, grainy but clear security footage played. It showed Liam and his friends cornering Maya, kicking her cup, their laughter silent but their menace palpable. The images played on a loop, a damning indictment for all to see. Records began to surface as other reporters, now in a frenzy, received emails from Sarah's outlet containing the files she had uncovered. The buried police report, screenshots of Liam's social media posts bragging about his father's influence, a sworn affidavit from a business owner whose windows had been broken after he'd asked Liam's friends to move along. The truth was no longer a secret whispered in an alley. It was a public record, broadcast and documented, and it was coming for Councilman Richard Harris and his son. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the Harris family. Sarah Jenkins's story, complete with the video evidence and the buried police report, went viral within the hour. The headline was simple and devastating. Councilman's son accused of assault, witness harassment, police department implicated in cover-up, public outrage erupted. The mayor's office was flooded with calls. The police chief, a man who owed his appointment to Richard Harris, found his position untenable. Under the searing glare of public scrutiny, he held a press conference. He announced that Sergeant Miller had been placed on indefinite administrative leave pending a full internal affairs investigation. He announced that the assault case against Liam Harris was being officially reopened and assigned to the Major Crimes Division. Within 24 hours, arrest warrants were issued. Liam Harris and his 2 friends were taken into custody, not from their dorm rooms, but from their family homes. The images of a handcuffed, weeping Liam being led into a police car were a stark contrast to the arrogant bully in the alley. Councilman Richard Harris, facing a recall petition and an ethics investigation, resigned in disgrace. His carefully constructed world had crumbled to dust. The Sons of Odin held their own press conference a few days later, on the steps of the now-vacant office of the former councilman. Preacher, flanked by Bear and other chapter members, stood at a podium. He was not a polished speaker, and he read from a simple, handwritten statement. "We are not the law," he began, his voice a low rumble that carried without a microphone. "We do not seek to be the law, but when the law looks away, we will not. We are a brotherhood, and we protect our own. And sometimes our own are the people this city forgets. This city forgot about a child named Maya. We didn't." His words were sparse, consequential. He took no questions. The statement was enough. The true resolution, however, was not about punishment. It was about restoration. The story had touched a nerve in the community, and donations began to pour into a fund Sarah Jenkins had linked in her article. But the Sons of Odin had their own plan. They pooled their own resources, pension funds, private savings, the proceeds from a dozen chapter fundraisers. They didn't want charity. They wanted to provide a foundation. Doc, using his knowledge of city logistics, found a small, two-bedroom house on the east side that had been foreclosed on by the city. It was dilapidated, its windows boarded up, its yard overgrown with weeds. But it had good bones. They bought it at auction for a fraction of its value. Then they went to work. The resolution became a montage of constructive action. Dozens of bikers descended on the property, not with chains and knives, but with tool belts and paint rollers. Plumbers fixed the leaky pipes. Electricians rewired the faulty circuits. Roofers laid new shingles. They worked with the same silent, disciplined efficiency they had displayed at City Hall. They tore out the stained carpets, sanded the hardwood floors, and painted the walls a warm, hopeful shade of yellow. They planted a small garden in the front yard. The final scene of justice was not in a courtroom, but on the front porch of this renewed house. Preacher, Bear, and a few others brought Maya to see it. She stared at it, her eyes wide with disbelief. Bear held out a single, shiny brass key. "It's yours, Maya," he said, his gruff voice thick with emotion. "No one can ever kick you out. It's a home." She took the key, her fingers tracing its sharp edges. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt the solid ground of belonging beneath her feet. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. Dignity had been restored, not by a verdict, but by an act of collective grace. 1 year later, the ripples of that day on the City Hall steps continued to spread, changing the moral landscape of the city in small but significant ways. The house on the east side was no longer just a structure. It was a sanctuary. Maya had filled it with light and color. Canvases leaned against the walls, covered in vibrant, expressive paintings that told stories of shadow and resilience. She was enrolled in community college, her tuition paid for by a scholarship fund established in the wake of her story. She was studying art, rediscovering the lines her mother had taught her to see. The front garden bloomed with sunflowers, their bright faces turned toward the sun. She spent her weekends volunteering at a downtown youth shelter, her quiet presence a source of comfort for kids who saw their own fragile histories reflected in her eyes. The Sons of Odin had channeled their newfound public profile into something permanent. They established Odin's Shield, a non-profit foundation dedicated to providing legal aid, housing assistance, and mentorship for at-risk and homeless youth. Bear, having found a new purpose beyond the road, served as its full-time director. The foundation's office was downtown, its doors open to any kid the system had discarded. They were a place the police now sent runaways, a tacit admission of their own past failures. The city's institutions had been forced to reckon with their own apathy. The internal affairs investigation had led to the firing of Sergeant Miller and a complete overhaul of the 12th Precinct's community relations policies. A new civilian oversight committee was formed, with Sarah Jenkins appointed as one of its founding members. Her reporting had won a prestigious award for investigative journalism, and the Sentinel had become a trusted voice for the city's voiceless. Liam Harris, convicted of aggravated assault, served a 2-year sentence in a state correctional facility. His father, Richard Harris, moved away, his name becoming a local cautionary tale about the corrosive effects of power and impunity. The legacy of that confrontation was etched into the city's consciousness. The final scene unfolded on a warm autumn afternoon. Maya was on a scaffold, putting the finishing touches on a massive mural she had been commissioned by the city to paint on the side of a community center. The mural was a breathtaking piece of art. It depicted a great, slumbering bear, its massive form a protective curve around a single, impossibly resilient flower growing from a crack in the pavement. Surrounding them both, rendered in subtle shades of gray and black, was a circle of watchful, silent riders on their machines. Their faces were not visible, but their posture was one of unwavering guardianship. A low rumble turned her head. Down the street, a half-dozen bikes from the Sons of Odin pulled up. Preacher and Bear were in the lead. They parked and walked over, tilting their heads back to look up at her work. They didn't offer effusive praise. That wasn't their way. They just stood and absorbed it, a quiet understanding passing between them. Preacher nodded slowly, a deep sense of satisfaction in his eyes. He looked at the flower, then at Maya, then at the painted riders. "No one is no one," he murmured, the words a benediction. A local coffee shop owner, one of the same men who had once looked away, came out carrying a tray of steaming cups. "On the house, gentlemen," he said, offering it to the bikers. They accepted with quiet nods of thanks. The community was no longer silent. The cycle of fear and apathy had been broken, replaced by a small, sturdy bridge of connection. Maya smiled down at them from the scaffold, a smudge of blue paint on her cheek, a citizen of a city that was slowly, painfully, learning to see.